So shortly after the birth of our second son, my wife Lisi started experiencing these intense, intermittent pains in her abdomen. And this went on for maybe a week or so. And then late one night, the pain got so bad that she was just doubled over. And she was laying there on the ground, completely balled up in pain. And so, we tried to figure out what to do. And we called a friend from church. These things always happen late at night, right? We called a friend from church over and decided that she would take Lisi to the hospital. And that hospital was off in another community. And I would stay home with the newborn baby and our little son. And sometime, she's gone. I got the kids settled down, went to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke from my fitful sleep to a pounding on the garage door. And at that point in time, our town, this little town in Washington State, had been stirred up by gang violence. And every once in a while, people were getting shot. Some of the buildings around town got tagged with graffiti. And so when that pounding came at the door again, I was not sure what to expect. My wife was sick and off in the hospital. It was just me and a baby and a toddler. And so I got up and I crept down the hall and I crept into the kitchen. There was this window into the door in the garage. And in the darkness, I could just see kind of this blurry outline of a head on the other side of the door. And it was possible to turn on a light in the garage, but the only way to do that was to walk over to where the door was to hit the light switch, which is right there by the window. And so I went over, that's what I did. I walked over to that dark door and I hit the switch. And on the other side of the door, I see Lisi. And it turned out that she went into the emergency room and they had determined that it was gallbladder issues, which happens sometimes after women give birth. And the pain had stopped and they told her, it's not an emergency, come back in the morning and we'll start working it out. And she had caught a taxi back to our town in the middle of the night. Now, it strikes me that that situation could have turned out quite differently under different circumstances. I was tired and disoriented and worried and scared, and if I would have been armed, and if I would have been willing to use that weapon, that situation could have ended badly. And in fact, a situation not unlike that one did end badly a number of years ago in Detroit. You may remember this story. A man named Theodore Wafer lived in a rough part of town in Detroit, and his community was stirred up by gang violence. Every once in a while, people were getting shot, and some of the buildings around town were getting tagged with graffiti. And in the middle of the night, someone came pounding on Mr. Wafer's door. And he got his shotgun, went to the door, opened it, and on the other side of the screen door saw someone in the darkness that he did not recognize, so he shot. And he said later in court, I was upset, I had a lot of emotions, I was scared, I had fear, I was panicking. And it turned out that the person on the other side of the door was a young woman who had gotten into a traffic accident and walking bloodied and disoriented had made her way up to his house looking for help. And tragically, in that fear, Mr. Wafer killed her, and he was later sentenced to 17 years in prison. Now, my point is not that I made the right decision and that he made the wrong one or something like that, but what I'm saying, what I'm trying to help us think about is the way that we live our lives and the convictions that underlie who we are going to set us up in intense situations to make certain kinds of decisions. We live in a moment in which there is a certain narrative out there that encourages us to carry weapons and be prepared to use deadly force. And at the same time, we also live in a moment in which there are a lot of voices out there trying to set people against the other, whoever that may be, the other. It's this xenophobic moment, xenophobia, the fear of the other, the fear of someone who doesn't look like us or talk like us or believe like us. And I think we've kind of made as a society this mental decision to use deadly force, and at the same time we've allowed ourselves to be swept along by a xenophobic fear of the other. And when we're at that point, we're kind of being mentally conditioned. We're being trained by certain forces in our society. It's kind of a cultural catechism to devalue life and to be willing to contemplate taking life. And so when we approach that door, and what we're willing to do when we get to that door has a whole lot to do with the values that we come to the door with, the values that we're committed to. And it turns out that the toxic mix of willingness to use violence in an atmosphere of fear runs precisely counter to the teaching of the Scriptures and that of Jesus. And you see, as followers of Jesus, we are not to take life, but to treasure it. Now, the sixth commandment, we're in this series on the Ten Commandments, right? The sixth commandment, Deuteronomy 5:17, in a lot of ways, it's pretty straightforward. You shall not murder. In the old King James Version, it's translated, the word in Hebrew is translated more broadly as kill. So thou shalt not kill. And obviously, killing is in view. Perhaps the better translation is murder. And murder is taking innocent life. That's the word that is used in the Old Testament to describe what happens when someone, it's the opposite of what happens when someone has accidentally taken life and has to run and take refuge in one of the cities of refuge that are set up so no one can come after them and get revenge on them. So murder is this word that's used for taking innocent life. It's the word used in Hosea 6:9 to describe what bandits do, right? They lay in wait and they murder. Now there's another word in Hebrew in the Old Testament that's used more generally for killing, and that word is harag, right? It kind of sounds menacing, harag. It's what the ancient Israelites did when they engaged in warfare. So Joshua haragged the people of Ai, and Gideon haragged the Midianites and their allies. And God wouldn't allow David to build the temple in Jerusalem because he had been a man of war. He had too much blood on his hands. He had haragged too many people. Now, of course, the Hebrew words, these two different words, murder or kill, it's kind of like in English, there's a lot of ambiguity to them. There's not a nice, neat division between killing and murder. Both involve taking life. And in the biblical way of thinking, both killing and murder are an affront to the moral order, because all life belongs to God, and human beings have been created in the image of God. And even in the Old Testament, where we read these terrible stories of slaughter and conquest, taking life was still regarded as something grievous, something that violated the moral order. And the first thing that this command from the Old Testament means is that we shouldn't take innocent life. And maybe that goes without saying, right? I mean, I think most of us don't find ourselves in situations where we are tempted to take innocent life, where we're tempted to kill something. But it's worth saying that. It's worth getting it out there, that this is what the commandment means, because as writer Wendell Berry puts it in one of his books, A World Lost, a man looking for somebody to kill can presumably find reasons and candidates everywhere, the human race being what it is. But I think the sixth commandment is pretty straightforward. Thou shalt not murder. Don't take innocent life. And I think about Desmond Doss, the World War II conscientious objector featured in the movie from a couple years ago, Hacksaw Ridge. And Doss refused to carry a weapon or to fight in World War II. He was sent into combat as a medic, and he didn't carry a gun, even though everyone around him was shooting and carrying guns. And he ends up running into heavy fighting to save dozens of wounded soldiers and really becomes a hero. Now, I haven't seen that movie, but there's actually a documentary that was made about him a couple of years before the movie came out, and I have seen that. And in the documentary, Doss talks about how in his Seventh-day Adventist household, he grew up seeing this little plaque on the wall that said, that had the Ten Commandments. And he remembers seeing that commandment on there, thou shalt not kill or murder, and how that struck him and stuck with him. And he had this very straightforward conviction that killing is not what God intends, that killing is not the way of Jesus. He just saw that all the time in his house, and it worked on him. Killing is not the way of Jesus, which is true. Jesus took the commandment not to murder or to kill. He took it to the next level. And so in Matthew 19, when the rich young ruler asked him which commands he had to keep in order to attain eternal life, Jesus started with this one. He said, you shall not murder. In Matthew 15, when Jesus taught about the evil intentions that come out of the human heart, the first one that he mentioned was murder. Twice in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus brought up this commandment. So Matthew 5:21, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire." And then again in the passage that we heard today, Matthew 5:43, Jesus takes up not the Old Testament law, but what must have been a common saying: love your neighbor and then hate your enemy. And I don't think there's any place, I'm sure there's no place in the Old Testament that says hate your enemy. Love your neighbor does come from Leviticus 19, but it's just what people say, right? And it kind of makes sense. It's pretty much what everyone has done from time immemorial. We love those that we perceive to be on our side, our friends, our family, our tribe, our community, our nation. And we hate our enemies, whoever that happens to be. We work for the good of our friends, and we do our best to bring down our enemies. That's pretty much what everybody's done from time immemorial. But Jesus says that will not be the way that you think about the world or the way that you operate. Jesus says that's not how our Heavenly Father operates. He says that God graciously grants mercy to all, rain on the just and the unjust alike. Jesus says that even tax collectors, the most despised and compromised sinners in the ancient Jewish community, he says even though they know how to love the people that love them, Jesus says that his people are to live by something that is far more stringent and challenging. He says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. And I think the fact that Jesus brings it back to love here, and that he brings in Matthew 5:21, when he talks about not murdering, he brings it back to not hating. I think that what this does is point towards a heart attitude. You see, thou shalt not kill is not just setting a rule, something for extreme situations. Thou shalt not kill opens up this whole other way of living, something that comes from the heart. This way of living that treasures the life of the other. Now think about the story in Genesis, the very first murder. That moment when violence was introduced into human history, Cain and Abel. There's these two brothers, and each bring a gift to God, and for some reason God rejects Cain's gift, but accepts Abel. And Cain is so mad that he kills his brother. And the blood of Abel cries out from the ground, right? It's this figurative language. And when God confronts Cain on this, and it's interesting that God confronts him, that God doesn't just outright reject Cain, but rather confronts him. That says something about the seriousness with which God takes the dignity, the human dignity, even of the life of a murderer, and also the possibility of redemption. And God confronts Cain, and he says, "Where is your brother Abel?" Do you remember this moment? Do you remember what Cain says at this moment in the story? God says, "Where's your brother Abel?" Do you remember what Cain says? He says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Right? Am I my brother's keeper? And I think that's so perfect. Where's your brother, Cain? Am I my brother's keeper? It's so perfect because in those spare, powerful words in Genesis, that is the implied, there's an implied answer. Cain not only committed a horrible act, killing his brother, taking life, Cain also failed at being his brother's keeper. Am I my brother's keeper? Yes, you are, Cain. Yes, you are. We are our brothers and sisters' keepers. And there's this whole outlook that flows out of not killing in the Old Testament that comes in, that you see in Jesus' teaching, and a lot of it comes back to that basic conviction that we are our brothers and sisters' keepers, that it's not just not doing the wrong thing, but having that ethic of life. We're supposed to be living our lives in such a way that the lives of brothers and sisters are treasured. And I think what that means is respecting and loving and promoting the lives of others. So it's not just about killing, it's about being the keeper of the brother or sister, having that gospel of life that we're living out. Now, this is something we do in our personal lives. I think it means not participating in systems that lead to the destruction of the lives of others. So we want to be people who are living out this vision of loving and respecting and promoting life, this culture of life. It's doing things like for me, not investing in tobacco companies, right? They lead to the destruction of the health of others. Or I don't want to be invested in something that, a company that plays a role in helping someone get an abortion, as complicated as individual stories of abortion always are. I don't want to be invested in something like that. On the flip side, it's also helping those who are in need around us. It's being aware of the ways that huge forces like poverty and racism stub out people's lives. And it's asking questions like, how do I live so that I am affirming human life? And I think that's the question we've always got to be asking ourselves. It's not just about not killing someone, but about those bigger issues of leading our lives in such a way that we are treasuring the life of others. It's about being pro-life in everything we do. That's the heart of the Old Testament command here, and it's where Jesus takes it. And I think this also says something about how we treat other people, even when we're not directly killing them. And I don't know, it strikes me that it's all too easy for us to essentially do character assassination of those that we don't agree with, right? How often do we treat people as if their beliefs just put them beyond the pale, right? Now, I do not have to respect you because whatever you believe, that just put you beyond the pale. It puts you beyond whatever merits being considered and treated with human dignity. I think there's always that temptation out there. And the other thing is that treasuring life is something that we have to think about as a community. So it's not just an individual thing. We've got to be asking ourselves, are we creating a culture of life across all aspects of our community and state and nation and world? Is that our vision? It's not enough, for instance, to be anti-abortion. The Christian thing to do is to ask how we create a culture that aids mothers who have their back to the wall, that aids babies and children who are growing up in situations of poverty. Treasuring life should bring us to ask questions about who has access to health care, good schooling, proper nutrition. We got to ask those big questions. And there's a way in which the whole apparatus of warfare goes against that. Now, at the end of the school year, I went on the 4th grade trip that our little son and his class made to see the Eisenhower Childhood Home and Presidential Library in Abilene. Maybe some of you have been there, right? So the Eisenhower Childhood Home and Library. It's pretty impressive. And Eisenhower, great president, he was no pacifist, right? Eisenhower was a man of war, both as a soldier and then later as supreme commander of the Allied forces in World War II. But one thing that Eisenhower said, and that it was hanging on a wall there in one of the buildings on this complex, one of the things that Eisenhower said really struck me, and it's this. He said, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies, in the final sense, a theft of those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete pavement. We pay for a single fighter with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. As our choices personally and how we work toward a vision of the good and beautiful community, our choices about how we vote, those are choices that lead toward creating a culture of life or not. Are they choices that, in Eisenhower's words, end in the theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed? And this commandment in the Old Testament, and especially the way Jesus interprets it and reiterates it, I think it calls us to ask those sorts of questions, right? To get beyond just the bare meaning of it, but to ask those larger questions. And the culture and the society that we create is going to set things up for what happens when we reach those moments where we've got to open a door. And how do we act? And how are things set up? Now, Mennonites have had a strong witness on this. We've traditionally taught that killing is always wrong, and that as followers of Jesus, we should not place ourselves in any situation where we would be called upon to take life, such as in the military. And that's correct in one way. Killing is not the way of Jesus. But sometimes this has meant that we don't have any guidance to give those who seek to serve their community and country in positions that involve bearing arms. Now, in the broader church, if you look out at the broader church, the guidance has been that even police officers and soldiers are not exempt from the command not to kill, and Jesus' teaching about love of enemies. In the 4th century, the theologian and Bishop Augustine, who is one of my heroes, the theologian and Bishop Augustine, he wrote to the local Roman governor Boniface, and he explained to him that it was possible for him and the soldiers that he commanded to continue to serve. And Boniface, no doubt, had read the Sermon on the Mount, and no doubt because of that, he had grave objections to taking life based on his Christian convictions. And what Augustine counseled him was that he must use whatever he's going to be doing. He must not look for an exception to the love of enemy, but he must act from a love of neighbor. And so he must be cautious, counseled Augustine, that he not allow his heart to be filled with hatred. And he says that for Christians, there's no exception for when it's okay to kill, but in the pursuit of safety for others, the love of neighbor, the pursuit of the common good, Christians throughout the centuries have believed that it's possible to use force and sometimes take life so long as the desire is for love of neighbor and not the desire to kill. Now, even in those scenarios, even when Christians like Augustine have tried to work this out, even in those scenarios, the evil of killing does not go away. Even in just service, when life is taken, it will always be necessary to be sorrowful for life taking and to seek God through repentance. It's interesting to me that another man, Basil of Caesarea, who was a bishop and theologian in the 4th century, a lot of bishops and theologians from the 4th century today, but Basil counseled soldiers who had killed in war and were coming back to his congregation. He counseled them not to take communion for 3 years. And I think the reason for that, don't take communion for 3 years, I think the reason for that is he recognized that there's going to need to be a time of healing that they're going to have to work through, a time of getting right with God and making peace with their own conscience. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of this ancient wisdom has come back around. And there's the experience of many in our own country who have returned from our long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places in the last number of years, and who have suffered from what has been called moral injury. Moral injury. It's this term that was coined as a way to describe the damage that's done to the conscience and to the soul that happens to many soldiers and others who experience warfare, because what they've seen, what they've experienced, because of what they have done. And it's often through counseling and empathetic listening, not through flag waving and parades, that returning soldiers are able to come to peace with themselves. And this is why the church must always, always seek to be a place of care and healing for those who have been impacted by warfare, including and maybe especially soldiers and their families. And I think that's part of how the church seeks to build this culture that treasures life, to live out this gospel of peace. And I think building that culture means so much more than just keeping the 6th commandment to not murder or kill. It's about following Christ in all things. He's the one who has poured out his life for the world, the one who calls us to imitate his example and open a door into a culture of life. You shall not murder. That's the word of the Lord. How will you live by that word? Amen.